I'm Michael Pearson. This is The Human Condition. Today we're talking about methods of neurofeedback. There are a number of methods of neurofeedback available to you, mostly from psychologists and chiropractors and naturopaths in the United States. Neurofeedback is a method that grew out of EEG, which was the detection of brain waves. And then very quickly, after detecting brain waves that were coming out of our brains, doctors realized that we might be able to modify these brain waves. We might be able to train people with feedback to be able to normalize or correct or optimize their brain waves. So almost immediately upon discovering EEGs, neurofeedback came about because instantly people started to do this. Now, there's a bunch of neurofeedback types out there. There's many, many types, and some of them are based on older technology, and some are based on new technology, and that doesn't make them bad or good. That makes them different, and that makes them tools that are very, very useful. Sometimes the old methods are cheaper and better and just as good, and sometimes the new methods are really necessary and required. So I'm going to talk about that today, the range of neurofeedback. I should say first that neurofeedback is a subdivision of something called biofeedback. Biofeedback is where a person or a doctor, either an individual or an individual with their doctor, uses some kind of instrumentation, some kind of tool to measure something about physiology that's normally not measurable or manipulable with your everyday senses, in order to manipulate and correct that finding. So for example, it's not typical for a person to be able to control the temperature of their forehead. But if you got a thermometer and it was a surface thermometer and put it on your forehead and you could look at the readout, you could learn to make your forehead warmer or colder as you use the feedback mechanism of seeing the results from the thermometer in your hand. Likewise, you could put a galvanometer on your fingers, which is a sweat detector that detects the sweat of your fingers, and that measures your autonomic nervous system. It measures specifically your sympathetic nervous system, and what it does is it measures the electrical conductance across that skin. And so that might be a way of you measuring your stress. If you're very sympathetic dominant and you're very fight or flight, you might make a whole lot of sweat, and you might detect that with a device that hooks up to a machine that you see a readout or a graph, or you hear a sound that tells you if you're getting too high or too low, or a sound that rewards you or tells you not to do that. And you can set those settings to anything you want. So biofeedback is the concept of really measuring anything that is normally not measurable and not manipulable, and making it accessible to us and saying, wow, I can do this. In fact, there's even pelvic floor biofeedback, where a person can modulate their pelvic floor tension, and they can put electrodes under their bottom, and they can measure the muscles of the pelvic floor and the sphincters, and they can learn to either tighten them up if they're weak, or they can relax them if they're too tight, and they can do all of this. And there are, in fact, specialists that have specialty training in those particular forms of biofeedback. They work with psychologists, they work with doctors, they work with neurologists, they work with chiropractors. And so we all together, the naturopaths and all of us, work together to try to understand what's wrong with a person's physiology, and use this mostly with the autonomic nervous system to help a person learn to control some aspect of their brain and body. So biofeedback has within it neurofeedback, and neurofeedback is defined as really measuring the nervous system, especially the brain. And so we're measuring the brain, we're getting feedback and changing brain waves. So neurofeedback is usually not just autonomic, like sweat on the fingers or temperature of the forehead, but actual brain waves directly. And so when we measure those direct brain waves, we're trying to manipulate them and control them and learn to make them more or less voltage, more or less coherence or crosstalk or communication, and many other things. So original neurofeedback was a couple of wires stuck to a person's head with paste, or in some cases drilled into the skull with a screw that actually drilled into the skull, and that's still used in some cases, but not everyday clinical. It's more a part of research. And so those electrodes on the head can measure brain waves, and they can go to a machine, and the doctor or the patient can learn to look at those brain waves and manipulate them. And that's the simplest method, and that was really elucidated in the 1930s and 40s. And today that's single and multi-electrode. I mean, nobody really does one electrode, but it's just a few electrodes, and it's placed around the head, and you can do that to train different waves up and different waves down. You can manipulate theta and beta waves. You can decide that you're going to take a wave up or a wave down in amplitude. and you can do some very basic things to change the different voltages or power of output of different frequencies in different regions of your brain. So in the 1930s to 1980s, I would say, doctors would look at patients and they would ask them questions. They would give them a survey. They might take an EEG, but they might not. Most of the time they wouldn't. And they would ask them survey questions about their brain function. And through those survey questions, if they knew a lot about the brain, they could pick an area of the brain and say, well, that's the area, and it's probably this kind of wave, alpha or delta or theta, and they would measure it, and they would then reward the person with some kind of sound or some kind of flashing light or some kind of even subwoofer speakers under their seat playing music. There's all kinds of ways that you can give people feedback where they know if their brain waves are closer to what we want, which is the goal, or farther away from the goal. And so that's the most basic form of neurofeedback, which is a few electrodes, a few wires stuck to your head that are measuring your brain waves and giving you feedback through sound or light or touch or vibration that say, yep, that's good, or no, that's not so good. And so as the person begins to get that feedback, as long as it comes to you within 500 milliseconds or less of the actual brain event, your brain can learn and associate and tie that reward signal with your brainwave and learn to change that brainwave. If the reward is, if the reward or punishment, if you will, or signal is in any way delayed more than 500 milliseconds after the brainwave was emitted, your brain can't grab that and can't tie it together and say that was from this. So it has to be real time. So what that brings us to is the advent of computers. And as computers got better and better, they began to have higher and higher processing power, and we could do more and more electrodes, and we could see more and more pathways. And then with the advent of some mathematics called the fast Fourier transformation, or FFT, which is a mathematical formula and system of algorithms that are applied to data that allow a computer to take and ask a question of every bit of data that comes in and do it over and over and over again very, very quickly. Once computers got fast enough to be able to do that, we got surface maps called QEGs. That means that we could see the surface of the first 6 millimeters of the brain, and we could see what was that all doing, and we could start to make color maps over time, and we could say, wow, instead of looking at the waves as they come out and watching them as they emerge, we could measure them over 10 minutes or longer, and we could see what's the preponderance of alpha or beta or delta waves in the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe or the temporal lobe. And so through that method, we could begin to see what was happening, and we could train people, and we could start to say, wow, in real time, we can start giving them feedback and saying, let's change more things. Because originally it was limited to how much could one doctor look at a time and make the changes and make the feedback. But with a computer that can read all those lines simultaneously and initiate a reward all within 500 milliseconds simultaneously, the doctor can still program what is necessary, but the doctor isn't doing it in real time, the machine is doing it in real time. So that's where you get surface neurofeedback, where you get QEG guided neurofeedback. And that's where you're actually taking a QEG map of the surface of the brain and you're doing surface training all over the brain simultaneously. And the really cool thing about that is because you're measuring the whole brain with a full cap, you are not letting any one area of the brain wrong itself as another area rights itself. In the old method, when you put a couple of electrodes on a person, you're not measuring the rest of the brain. So as the area under the electrodes gets better, you don't know if the person's strategy wronged another area of the brain. You don't know if it made it worse. So the advent of higher processing speeds and more graphics card technology and the ability to process all this information faster than 500 milliseconds allowed us to be able to give massive amounts of neurofeedback throughout the entire surface of the brain and throughout the rest of all the waves simultaneously. So we could simultaneously train alpha waves and delta waves and theta waves. We didn't just have to train one at a time or two at a time. We could do all the different waves in all the different areas of the surface. Now, the fast Fourier transformation also allowed us, with more processing power, to be able to go deeper than 6 millimeters, deeper than the surface of the brain. We were able to go deeper with this fast Fourier transform formula to be able to say, wow, we can read inches down into the brain. And inches down into the brain is something called the limbic cortex. LIMBIC. The limbic cortex is is the emotional brain. It's the part of the brain that controls your immune system. It controls your endocrine system, your hormones. It contributes to your sleep. It is part of where your conscience is located, if you'll allow me some leeway. It's where, when we study police, when they make snap decisions to shoot or not shoot, that is in the posterior cingulate, which is the back of the limbic system. There's a whole bunch of different sectors in there that regulate the autonomic nervous system. How active is the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system going to be? And a bunch more. So with the advent of much better processing power, we started to look at the surface of the brain in a new way. And then that was the surface QEG maps, which are round and circular, and they're surface maps. Then we began to do S-Loreta, which was low resolution tomography, which is looking at the brain in slices and being able to go beyond the surface and to look deeper into the brain like an MRI does or a CT scan does by looking at slices and putting those slices back together. Because the cap around your head is somewhat analogous to the way the pickups are in the MRI machines and the CT machines, because they go around your brain and they do different scans at different levels, doing a virtual slice of your brain, looking at all the different layers and being able to create three-dimensional maps of your brain's electrical function. So the neurofeedback becomes highly advanced when you can read all the surface, all the deep, and everything that is detectable with cells that are made of giant pyramidal cells of Betz, which is the name of those cells. As long as they're giant pyramidal cells of Betz, we can read them. If they're different kinds of cells, we can't read them, and if they're too far, we can't read them. Like, we can't read the brainstem, we can't read the mesencephalon, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. We can't read the cerebellum. Those are things that we can't use that. We have to use neurological examination, and we can certainly figure that out with neurological examination. Eye movement examination, there are infrared camera rigs that we have that can measure eye movements, and through that method we can really figure out how the brainstem and the cerebellum is working, but that's not QEG, that's not S-Loreta, that's another system. So neurofeedback involves a progression of few electrodes, 2, 4, 6, 8 electrodes on the head, to a full cap doing a surface of the brain, and then that's called a surface QEG, and then there's QEG S-Loreta, which is the surface and deep brain, where we're looking at the whole brain. And in fact, not only are we looking at amplitudes, which is the first thing that was really measured, we're looking at coherence. And I've spoken earlier about amplitude versus coherence. Now, amplitude is the power of the brain waves. If the alpha waves or beta waves are a certain frequency, the alpha waves are a little slower, the beta waves are a little faster, and the alpha waves are loud, and the beta waves are not so loud, that loudness or the height of the wave is the amplitude. The length of the wave is the frequency, which is how fast they go. So alpha waves are slower, beta waves are faster, but the amplitude is how loud they are. So think of this as, think of the frequency as the voice of a choir member. Low frequencies like delta and theta and alpha, low frequencies are like the bass singers in a choir. They have low voices, low frequencies, low. And they may be loud or not loud. If they're quiet, they have low amplitude. If they're loud, they have high amplitude or high voltage, high power. Doesn't change their frequency, they're still low voices. If they're high frequency voices like the sopranos and the altos, those might be the mid beta and high beta and gamma waves that are the waves of the brain that are really high frequency, fast waves. Those singers could be singing very quietly, which means high frequency but low amplitude. So they're singing very quietly. They could also sing with a very loud amplitude. And so that's the high pitched sounds of the choir singing at a very loud volume. So think of frequency as how fast or low or high the sound is, or the frequency or the energy, and then think amplitude is how much power, how much voltage, how much loudness. This is how much loudness. How loud is that part of your brain singing? And we see that a lot of times people's brains are just singing too quietly for comfort or too loud for comfort in a certain frequency in a certain area. So alpha in the front or beta in the back or on the left side or wherever it is. We find that, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but that's essentially what a QEG shows us, is where is the brain not firing correctly? And neurofeedback helps train the person, give them rewards, flashing lights and sounds and video games and movies and videos and watching movies. There's all kinds of methods by which the computer senses your brain waves and gives you a feedback that rewards you or not so much punishes you, but kind of tells you, no, don't do that. All kinds of different ways to get you to change your brain waves back to the goal of what we want. Now, in the early days, there weren't any z-scores. There weren't any normal numbers. There was just, these amplitudes that seemed high or seemed low, and we would look at patients and we would ask questions and we would infer that they were too low or too high, and we would then train them. Now today we have these wonderful research studies from all over the universities for many decades that show normative or reference data from thousands of people your age or gender that we can compare you to and say, our goal for you at rest is this. And so we want you to sit here and train with this machine using neurofeedback to listen to sounds and lights, because mind you, no electricity goes into your head. And then you can train your brain without electricity to get back to normal. Or back to ideal, or if you decide that's ideal. Some people decide that z-scores are not their ideal, and that's okay. Most of us in in clinical work, us clinicians really do like z-scores because they're reproducible and they're consistent and they're reliable, and they hold across cultures and across genders and across there's a lot of neat stuff. There are some problems with z-scores, and there's a whole discussion about different types of people and different variations of normal. There are also other types of neurofeedback. There are some other pathways that are very good, some that involve putting little bits of current into the brain, little bits of electrical current that are very, very safe and very, very low. Most generally don't, most therapists don't use those, but they are available and they're safe, and I've used them and they're very, very useful, very good tools. And like every tool, they have a use, and it all depends on the individual. Part of my job is difficult cases. I get referrals from doctors. That's all I do. So all of my cases are people that have had a problem and the doctor is stumped and says, what do I do next? And so I give second opinions and I try to help them figure out what to do next. That's my entire job as a chiropractic neurologist. So the neurofeedback may have methods that most of them don't involve any electrical current into the brain. A few methods do. They put electrical current into the brain, some kind of microcurrent or tiny little current to correct brain function. And there are other types of things too. I just spoke about Amplitude. There's another system called multivariate coherence, and there's directional coherence. And all these have to do with, if this area of the brain or this area of the brain is too loud or too quiet, that was amplitude. That was the loudness of the brain. Coherence is not so much loudness as much as it is how much is this area dependent on this area. It's like codependence. It's like if this area is talking to this area saying, I need you to help me, they'll be entrained together and they'll be working together and they'll be processing the same information. Now, there is a right amount and a wrong amount of shared information in the brain. There is too much and there is too little. The brain should share some information region to region, and it should also work independently somewhat region to region. If all of the brain areas are doing the exact same processing, then you don't have an efficient brain. So we don't want our brains to be entirely coherent, because then every brain area is doing the same thing. And healthy brains do different things at different times. This area is doing something different while this area is doing something different. We don't want them to be exactly the same. So high coherence is bad, and low coherence is bad. This is coherence or connectivity. And so to just give you an introduction to that idea, we don't know whether this group of cells is directing this group of cells to do something, or this group of cells is leading them to do something. So that's called directional coherence. And then there's multivariate coherence, which is to say, how does this area work with this area, and 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 this, and all the other areas across the brain. How does it work together? And so multivariate coherence simultaneously looks at the brain as a network and says, is it efficiently working or is it not efficiently working? Because many people have too much crosstalk. There's too much noise in the classroom, if you will. It's very much like a noisy classroom where the students are talking to each other too much and they're not doing their own independent work. It's also even more analogous to a workroom, like a floor of a company, where everyone is doing different work. In a classroom, all the students are doing the same work generally, but in a business, all the different people in the business are presumably doing different work. And you want them to do different work, but you want them to be somewhat coherent and somewhat in concert with each other and have some of the same goals. So they need to have some crosstalk. If you were looking at a group of workers in an office building, those workers should talk to each other a little bit, but not so much that they can't get their own work done. And if they're injured and they can't get their own work done, they tend to, if they're really bad, not talk to each other and just fail, or talk to each other too much and request too much help. And so they start to request help in processing from other cells and other regions, and they get this communication where they try to share processing. And when we see this hypercoherence, that's something that we can train downward. We can train the person to stop doing that, and we can help them get better, especially if we're supporting them nutritionally as well. But in any case, neurofeedback can train people, not just for amplitude, to train down the volume or the loudness or the voltage, but we can train down or up the amplitude, as well as training down or up the coherence or crosstalk of the brain. There are many other neurofeedback methods. There are some proprietary methods out there. There's all kinds of different avenues you can go down. There is infraslow fluctuation and other types of very slow brain waves that are way slower than the slowest delta waves that we're discovering and I work with. And those can be measured and trained. We call it training because we're actually training a patient. We're not treating them, we're training them. So it's a very holistic type of method. And the infraslow fluctuation is very slow brain waves. We're talking about, the slowest brain wave you may have heard of is delta, which is 1 to 3 cycles per second. So if you think of 1 second intervals, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 1, 2, or even 1, 1. That's the speed of the wave. Is very slow. 1 to 3 cycles per second is the delta. So as a person looks at delta, that's a wave that has to do with brain restoration and sleep and healing. But there are infraslow fluctuations that are way slower than that. And instead of 1 cycle per second, they're at like 0.0030. So we're talking about 3 decimal places, from the zero. So this is infraslow fluctuations. Those methods I work with, and they are extremely useful for people with emotional problems, people with PTSD, people with trauma, anxiety, sleep disorders. And so are the other methods too, but it's just a matter of knowing that there's a choice. There's different kinds of methods. You can train amplitude, you can train coherence, you can train both. You can train directional coherence, you can train multivariate coherence, you can train infraslow fluctuation. You can also train infraslow fluctuation with S-Loreta, the full cap, and you can combine these things. And so we're getting to be able to combine more and more. Every year as computers get stronger and stronger and more powerful and faster, we can add more stuff and we can help train the brain to do more complex things faster. And so neurofeedback is getting cheaper, it's getting more effective, it's getting faster at helping people. And in fact, original neurofeedback really was considered 60 to 90 sessions was pretty much the way it worked, and it was about $100 per session. And today we have much more complex systems, and in many cases people start feeling better in 8 to 10 sessions. So today we do therapeutic trials of 8 to 10 sessions to see if someone's feeling better after we do a QEG, which is very helpful because a QEG will help us understand what's wrong with their brainwaves and what's right, and we can show them, here's really good function, here's not so balanced function, and we can tie that to their symptoms, and we can say, this brain region does these things. Does it match your symptoms? And lo and behold, it does. So it's very useful for us as long as the doctors and technicians are extremely skilled at performing QEG brain maps and neurofeedback. And I should say that today neurofeedback, a lot of it is done. It's live QEG S-Loreta simultaneously with your neurofeedback. So you're getting a QEG and or S-Loreta scan. So it's called QEG and S-Loreta guided neurofeedback. So you're actually getting a brain scan every single visit to see what your brain is doing. And the software shows your brain in 3D, the surface and the deep, so that you can see the limbic system. You can turn the brain around in 3D and look at it. It's amazing today what we can do with these simple, mobile laptop gaming computers. So neurofeedback has evolved from simple electrodes stuck to your head or screwed into your head, to many electrodes, to a full cap that measured the surface of the brain, to a full cap whose math and processing power could actually measure the deep parts of the brain as well as the surface of the brain. That was called S-Loreta QEG neurofeedback. And so we can train a whole bunch of things. the amplitude, we can pick voltages, we can pick regions of the brain, we can train coherence and crosstalk in the brain, and we can train infraslow fluctuations in the brain. We can also look at many more things, and there will be more discussions of this topic, and there are specialty types of things that can be done for people. But it's really interesting to understand that you can do all this simultaneously if you have a powerful enough system. And those systems are expensive. Not all doctors have them. Many doctors have a startup system that is much more simple, and I'm a big fan of that. There are lots of doctors and psychologists that have a very simple system to do simple neurofeedback. It costs the doctor less money and it costs the patient less money, and that's great. I think that's wonderful, and I think that more people should benefit from that. My particular role in this is that I'm a specialist, so I often get asked to help with the people that it didn't work for. So my role is, what do you do when they tried that and it didn't work? Or it made them worse? So I do more advanced neurofeedback, I do more advanced types of QEG with S-Loreta, and I look at more statistical measures than I've talked about today. But the point is, there are lots and lots of answers, and there's lots and lots of software and hardware and materials and methods out there in the world of neurofeedback to help the brain get better. But the gist of it is, help your chemistry, do your brain rehab for the parts of the brain that you can't see with neurofeedback and QEG, and use QEG and neurofeedback to help the parts of your brain that QEG and neurofeedback can see. That's kind of the approach, along with counseling. It's very important that if a person has any mental illness or mental symptoms, that they see a counselor or a psychiatrist for either medication or counseling or both. And I'm not against medication. I just want to explain that sometimes medication can be and should be reduced by your prescriber, and I help with that. That's what I do. And I can't always do it, but it's our goal. And in fact, every pharmacology textbook says that the goal should be not long-term therapy with most drugs. It should be short-term, and it should always be aimed at reducing the number of drugs and the dosage of drugs. And most drugs are not designed or studied for long-term use. So the idea is, and by the way, you can have neurofeedback and QEG if you're on medications. There's lots of information that's known about what common medications do to modify and change a person's brain waves. And so it's just because a person's on a psychotropic medication doesn't mean they can't have neurofeedback necessarily. Some people will be very fragile, and we're very careful with them, but we're careful with everybody. But the idea is there's so much you can do with neurofeedback, and there's a world of different options out there, even more than I've explained today. Thank you.